Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
It's Tuesday. It's my favorite time of the week, so it's time for another installment of Nightlight Part 2. Welcome, everyone. Alexa, bring me a best-selling author on out-of-place artifacts. And just like that, David Brody suddenly appears to discuss his latest captivating book, Romerica. And if you want to learn more about our guest, you can visit his website, davidbrodybooks.com. Hi, Dave. How are you? Barbara, is David muted?
Go.
How you doing?
Thank you for having me on. It's good to be with you, Mark.
Yeah. Glad you're here. So Romerica is the 11th book in your Templars in America series. I got another fascinating international political espionage thriller book. Whatever genre you want to put it in, you have a little bit of everything in there: biblical history, ancient history of America as well. Terrific book, and we're going to spend most of the evening discussing it. And let's start off with basically the opening with Crane Castle overlooking Plum Island. Is this Plum Island the one where Dr. Hannibal Lecter is going to be sent with the deal he made with the senator from Tennessee?
No, that's Plum Island on Long Island. So this is this is up on the north shore of the north shore of Massachusetts, right where the Merrimack River empties into the Atlantic, which is really pretty much the highway. If you came across in ancient times, came across the Atlantic, and you wanted to go inland in the New England region, you came up the Merrimack River. So this book, Mark, you mentioned it's the 11th book in the series. This one came together really quick. Normally, it takes me about 6 months or so to write one of these books. They're about 300 pages, between writing and rewriting and whatnot. This one, I kept track. It was 101 days. And, of course, part of that was because during a pandemic, what else are you going to do, right? You got nothing else to do besides sit in your office and do paperwork. So I did a lot of writing. But also, it was one of those stories that just sort of poured itself out of me. I stumbled upon a newspaper article from about 4 years ago talking about after a big storm, a husband and wife went out to Plum Island, which is, again, a barrier island on the north shore of Massachusetts. After a storm, they went metal detecting regularly. This is what they did as a hobby. And they went out there, and they started getting all these hits. It was crazy. They found over 20 Roman era coins, all clustered together near this stone jetty. It's called a groin. And the newspaper wrote about it, and I said, well, that's sort of interesting. But it turns out that periodically over the years, all along the North Shore of Massachusetts, these Roman coins kept turning up. And so, you know me, Mark. I've done your show a number of times, and you've read my books, and I like nothing more than historical mystery. So I said, well, what's going on here? How come we have so many Roman coins? And if you ask the traditional historians, the academic types, they say things like, well, maybe a seagull picked up the coins in Europe and flew across the Atlantic and dropped them on the beach. And I'm thinking, wow, that's one pretty impressive seagull, 22 coins, dropping them all together after 3,000 miles. That's just silly. Or sometimes you hear, well, maybe, a grandfather wanted to entertain his grandkids. They went to the beach and he buried the coins and let the grandkids find them. And okay, so maybe he happened to have a couple of pennies and nickels and dimes in the change compartment of his car, and that's what he did. But he wouldn't use Roman coins, right? And then you hear, well, maybe in ancient times they used Roman coins as ballast, like in colonial ships. Like, that makes no sense. Have you ever heard of coins being used as ballast? You got stones and rocks and whatever. So anyway, so you start hearing all these things, and you roll your eyes and say, well, how about maybe there were Roman ships that came across, either they came on purpose or they got blown off course, and maybe they got shipwrecked off the coast of Plum Island, where, by the way, there are literally hundreds of shipwrecks because of just the way that area is, with all the eddies and the tides coming in and the rivers coming out, and the need for shelter after storms. There's all these shipwrecks. And maybe there's shipwrecks, and after a big storm, the shipwreck, which sits on the bottom of the ocean, gets disturbed, and the coins get dislodged, and they wash ashore, and people find them. So this is where it all started. I started looking at these things, and it turns out that there are literally dozens of Roman-era artifacts scattered around the East Coast, the Ohio River Valley, Mark, your neck of the woods, down in South America, and they all cluster to right around the 2nd century AD. It's not just Roman era, it's all 2nd century AD. It's almost like, they all sort of tell the same story. So, I went down that rabbit hole, and I was really surprised at all the different artifacts that we'll talk about them tonight, but all the different artifacts we found. And it turns out also, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but, they also tie back to things that other people have written about, people like Rick Osman, who has done a lot of research out in the Ohio River Valley about things like, the Bar Kokhba uprising in Israel in the early 2nd century, and all sorts of interesting historical things that are tied in. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is the reason this book came together so quickly in only 101 days is because the pieces fit together really neatly, and that doesn't always happen. When it does happen, it tends to mean that we're on the right track, that I'm on the right track. So that's sort of the overview of all of this. And we can get into the nitty-gritty of it, but it was an exciting book to research and to write because it came together so quickly. And you can probably hear the excitement in my voice. I'm pretty happy with the way it came out.
Oh, I think it's a terrific book. Aside from, it has like a personal interest to me because it's somewhat local. It was just an exciting read, interesting. Thinking a little bit, we get into the number of the antiquarians who wrote about the same thing 200 years ago. So this theory has been around. The evidence has been there for a very long time.
Yeah, and more, I think when you talk about the antiquarians writing about it, you saw a lot of it in the early 1800s, and most of it was out in the Ohio River Valley, not so much in New England. There was some, but more than half, I would say, were in Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia. Lots of artifacts turning up that just seem to defy common sense. And you saw a lot of historians back then writing about, an ancient tribe or, who could it be, especially because a lot of these artifacts had Hebrew writing on them. And so that sort of gave rise to the ancient tribe thing. And then there was a lot of people in more recent times who theorized Welsh, Prince Madoc, maybe something going on with that. But Madoc is later than 2nd century. He's either 6th century or 11th century or 12th century, depending on which Madoc you get. But that didn't really fit. So, but yeah, you're right. This has been going on for a couple hundred years now. This mystery of why all these European/Roman artifacts, Mediterranean artifacts, let's say, in the Ohio River Valley, they just keep coming up. People keep finding them. So, what's the story? I think I might have stumbled upon the answer, but maybe I'm wrong. But whether I'm right or wrong, there definitely is a story here that someone someday is going to figure out.
Yeah, and since we're on the topic at the moment about the antiquarians, you're quoting this of Tennessee Supreme Court in the 1820s is commenting on some Roman coins, just in Caleb Atwater's 1820 publication, he does write several Roman coins said to have been found in a cave near Nashville in Tennessee, bearing date not many centuries after the Christian era, have excited some interest among antiquarians. So there, we have our very own Nashville reporter who could look into that. But you are documenting many sources. There's the 1823 drawing of the Hanukkah fort.
Yeah, so
all the stuff is 200 years old.
So for those of your listeners who may not be familiar with my work, so the books are historical fiction, but the key part of that is historical. They really are based on historical artifacts, historical sites. The story itself is a modern-day adventure story, a thriller, and of course that part is fictionalized. But the artifacts that drive the entire story are actual artifacts. And we can't say for certain, how old they are. Some of them we know for certain. A coin obviously has a date on it, or where they came from. Again, coins we know, some things we don't know. But a lot of these have science behind them, whether it's optically stimulated luminescence testing or carbon dating or other kind of science behind them. So we do know the age of some of these. You mentioned the Hanukkah fort, and we'll talk about the sort of the tie-in between these Roman era artifacts and possible Jewish connection later on in the conversation, I'm guessing. But that, for example, was drawn in 1823 by the Army Corps of Engineers, and so a lot of these were documented by the Smithsonian or by other governmental authorities, and so the provenance behind a lot of these artifacts is pretty solid. It's not like your brother-in-law's best friend's ex-girlfriend found a coin and now you're going to run around saying it must be ancient. Who knows where that came from? The provenance on these is much clearer, and so you can have one or two artifacts are called, as you know, out-of-place artifacts, and they can sometimes just be modern mistakes. They could just be somebody dropped something in the woods or whatever. But when you start having as many as we found in this particular book, and couple that with the really tight provenance of a lot of these, then you start saying, well, this can't just be coincidence. It can't just be outliers. Something really is going on here. There's a story that these artifacts tell. And so that's where we are. And as an author and as a researcher, that's when I know I've sort of hit critical mass and I can go ahead and write the book, is when I've gotten to the point. And this, by the way, this is my legal training. So, I'm a lawyer by trade. I've been practicing law for 33 years. And one of the things that we were trained, of course, in law school is how to analyze and identify and weigh and critique evidence. So that's what I'm trained in. So for me, this is always a question about, is there enough evidence? Do the artifacts speak loudly enough so that I can make my case? If I had a hypothetical jury, could I win the case? And in my case, my jury is the readers. Can I give the readers enough evidence, enough artifacts to convince them that the story is real? And when I get to that point, then I know it's okay to go ahead with the story I want to write. And if I can't get to that point, then I need to go back to the drawing board and try something else totally different, either a new story or new artifacts, whatever. But as I said earlier, in this case, it came together really quickly. There were so many Roman-era artifacts, and they told the same story that I'm pretty sure I'm on the right track with it.
Okay, well, we have, the couple examples, documented examples from a couple hundred years ago. I know Lee Pennington's written some articles for Ancient American Magazine that cover Roman coins being found near the Falls of Ohio.
Right.
Section.
Yeah, you mentioned Lee Pennington because he's been researching this for a really long time. Mark, is it okay if I sort of come at this the way that I learned about it, and that might explain to the readers where I'm coming from on it, as opposed to going.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Just because I think it will explain sort of with an establishing shot, if this were a movie, how I came upon this. But I came upon this through a book that was written by Rick Osman probably 10 years now, called The Graves of the Golden Bear. And Rick is a researcher out in Indiana, and Rick basically had a theory, and it's a fascinating theory, that you of course you know Rick really well, right, Mark?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay. So Rick has a fascinating theory that there was a Roman legion, the 9th Legion, that had been stationed in England along Hadrian's Wall, and that this legion in the 2nd century basically disappeared from history. No one's ever quite certain whatever happened to them. They were, one day they were in England, and then 10 years later they were nowhere to be found, and something happened to them. Rick theorized, and he came upon this theory because he was doing a lot of research in Indiana, and he found what he believes to be a series of Roman forts stringing across, going east-west, basically parallel to the Ohio River, basically crossing the Ohio River Valley. And Rick believes, and this book goes into it, that it was this 9th Legion that left England in the 2nd century, and for whatever reason came across to America, ended up in the Ohio River Valley. And this was sort of the start of it. And it's that sort of got me started. And so I was open to the idea of 2nd century Roman exploration because of Rick's book. I did something a little different. Rick has them coming straight from England immediately over to America. I found evidence in writings that indicate the 9th Legion left England and went to Israel to help in something called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, which is 132 AD, I believe. Don't quote me exactly. Sometime around 130 AD. It was the second Jewish rebellion. The first one, of course, was in 70 AD when King Herod put down the rebellion, and then a couple generations later, a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba led a second rebellion, and that's where the story of Masada, the massive suicide out in the desert, made famous by the Israeli security agency called the Mossad. It's named after the Masada. But all that happened during the Bar Kokhba uprising. Anyway, the 9th Legion apparently was in Israel during this time period, and some of the coins that were found in the Ohio River Valley are actually Bar Kokhba coins, literally Bar Kokhba's face on the coins. So one of the possibilities that I came up with is that the Ninth Legion went to Israel to put down the rebellion. We know that's true. Perhaps that during this rebellion, they somehow became allied with some factions of the rebellion. And we know from books such as the Copper Scroll of Qumran and the Copper Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, lists treasures buried during this uprising, hidden away from the Romans, totaling, I believe the total was, do you remember how much it was, Mark? Like $1.5 billion in today's dollars. So the Copper Scroll of Qumran lists $1.5 billion in today's dollars of treasures. So what if, never been found by the way, what if the Legion commanders or lieutenants or whoever, and whatever faction of Jewish uprisers decided collectively together to take this treasure and get the heck out of the war-torn Israel and go find safe haven someplace, and maybe that place was across the Atlantic, and maybe they ended up in the Ohio River Valley, and that would explain not only the Roman era and the Roman coins and Roman artifacts, but also the number of Jewish-related artifacts of that same time period. So that's sort of where I go with this, and I can't say for certain that that's what happened, but the pieces fit together. And so looking at it through that prism allows us to see all these coins, all these artifacts, all these Hebrew artifacts in particular. They all sort of make sense if you look at it as a second century Roman/Jewish excursion across the Atlantic with the treasures as a way to get away from whoever else wanted those treasures in the Mediterranean and in Europe. And so that's why I sort of came at it from that angle. And if we look at it that way, then the pieces fit together. So now if you want to start talking about the individual pieces, now we understand how they fit together.
Yeah, and you're saying that after a certain date, I think Rick said they kind of disappear from history about 117 AD if they go to
right. I haven't sticking around. I have them going from England to Israel around 130 AD and then disappearing after that. So I've got them going another 15, 18 years, whatever, and they eventually they put down the uprising and then they disappear because there is evidence that they may have been stationed in Jerusalem. Okay, so
having these, what Caleb Atwater said, a couple not long after the Christian era started. Okay, couple hundred years. That fits in the time frame. I think some of the photos that Lee Pennington uses in his articles, are that second, third century AD. The coins that you're showing in your book and are all clustered around several generations after the initial 70 AD uprising, and they eventually make their way to America. They have some of the, they're able to date the coins with, like the Roman emperors.
Right. The coins are easy to date because whoever's face is on the coin, you know what year that emperor reigned, and so that's the date of the coin. That's easy. And like you said, most of the coins are second century. There are some coins that are a little bit later, and from that I deduce that there probably was a little bit of trade going back and forth. So these guys came over here. There would have been a lot of them, obviously, and they came over and they had tons of money, and so other Romans would probably have wanted, if they knew about them being here, would have come back to trade every few years and help relieve them of some of that gold and silver that they took, happily so.
Yeah.
So that's why we have some later coins as well. But
I was just going to say, you have a few generations in there from when they first appear until they stop at a certain emperor's reign, and they aren't just one scattered here and there from a wide span of emperors. They're kind of concentrated within just a couple hundred years of each other. So I think what you're saying is several crossings over several generations. It makes sense.
Right, and we tend not to open our minds to the possibility of ancient peoples coming across the Atlantic, but the reality was that the Romans learned how to build their ships from the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians were kicking their butt in the Punic Wars, around 300 BC in that time range, and the Romans eventually figured out how to copy their ships. But the Phoenician ships were way bigger than what Columbus sailed over here with. So the Phoenicians were amazing seafarers. The Romans basically stole that technology, and so the ships that we're talking about, even around 2,000 years ago, were much bigger than Columbus had. And we know the Phoenicians were able to navigate around the tip of Africa up to the North Sea. They were out in the open ocean. They weren't just in the Mediterranean. So it's not at all a stretch to think that they could have crossed the Atlantic, either intentionally or just blown off course. And then we find these artifacts. So if we go into it thinking the possibility of the Bar Kokhba uprising being related to these artifacts, we start looking at these artifacts in more detail. For example, the Bat Creek stone in Tennessee, which for a long time people didn't understand the translation. They thought it was Paleo-Cherokee or something, and then Henrietta Mertz, a researcher, flipped it over on its head. It was upside down, displayed upside down at the Smithsonian all those years, and it translates to a comet for the Jews. And it turns out that a comet for the Jews is actually the battle cry of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And the reason for that, by the way, is Bar Kokhba means son of the star. So a comet for the Jews would be the star is the comet. So if this artifact, Bat Creek stone, by the way, which was artifacts found with it were carbon dated to the 2nd century, and it directly ties to the Bar Kokhba uprising because the translation is the same as the battle cry. And so we've got a coincidence of date, a coincidence of slogan, a coincidence of location because there's other artifacts found around near there. The burial mound, which had the body, which had the Bat Creek stone in it, there was one body turned sort of in a different direction than the Native American bodies, skeletons found nearby. There's so much just about that one artifact. But there's, again, other Jewish artifacts nearby, something, for example, called the Decalogue Stone in Newark, New York, which has the Ten Commandments described around it in Hebrew. And the wooden platform that rested on was carbon dated to around 135 AD, the exact time of the Bar Kokhba uprising. So there's some really strong evidence indicating something related to the Bar Kokhba uprising was happening in the Ohio River Valley in the early parts of the 2nd century. So, there has to be an answer to this. It can't just be people shrugging their shoulders. There's a story to tell, and, it's up to us to figure out what it is.
All of the examples you just reeled off, that sounds clearly like a pattern, not just one artifact makes some kind of coincidence.
Right.
There's something was definitely going on over a several generations of transatlantic crossings. I think you make a really good point.
Yeah,
there.
Mark, you brought up the I don't want to lose this because it was a good point you brought up and we didn't really elaborate on it. The Hanukkah fort, the drawing. If your listeners are able to do so, if you go on the website, where the images are listed. I think it's the last image listed before my books, but it's a fort that was drawn by the Army Corps of Engineers, and the fort looks exactly like a 9-branched Hanukkah menorah topped by an oil lamp. And if you know the story of Hanukkah, basically there wasn't enough oil in the menorah to last more than one day, and the miracle was it lasted 9 days. And so the symbols of Hanukkah are the menorah and the oil lamp. Well, this fort is designed, it's literally exactly a menorah and an oil lamp. There's just no way that would have happened accidentally. It's clearly a reflection of some ancient fort design that is meant to remind people of or pay homage to the Hanukkah holiday. So again, ancient Jews, along with the Ten Commandments on the Decalogue stone, and along with the Backseat stone, and there's just so much there. And again, they're all clustered in the Ohio River Valley, and they all seem to date back to that time period. But I didn't want to forget that you brought it up. Hopefully listeners can go to the website and look at some of these images. But that Hanukkah fort is pretty amazing. Every time I look at it, it makes me grin because I'm like, wow, look at that. It looks so much like a menorah with an oil lamp on the top. It's unbelievable.
Okay, so since we're talking about the Holy Land, Rome, you mentioned the Phoenicians, they have to cross the Atlantic to get here. So, one of the centerpieces of your book, Romerica, is delving into the ship designs from up to about the 6th century A.D. You have the how do you pronounce it? Trireme. Yeah. Trireme.
Right. So
let's talk about that.
The Romans copied the ship design from the Phoenicians, and most of these ships were designed for battle, a close-quartered battle in the Mediterranean. They weren't necessarily perfect or even designed for ocean travel. They had sails, so you could definitely sail them, but they also were oar-powered because in battle you wanted to be able to have your oarsmen maneuvering you around and getting in position to broadside and whatever. So in the story, because I have other angles which I won't talk about now and ruin the story for people, I needed the boat to be a trireme. Practically speaking, if the Romans did come across, it probably would not have been a trireme. A trireme, it could have made it across. We know that Julius Caesar sailed triremes up to the English Channel, so we know they were capable of ocean travel. But you wouldn't want to do that with a trireme. It's just not the best design for that kind of ocean travel. So it could have been blown off course accidentally. But practically speaking, they probably would have come across in a galley or something. But for plot reasons, I had it be a trireme. And again, I don't want to get into why that is because it will ruin the story for people. But the interesting thing is that the takeaway, I guess, is the Romans essentially captured a Phoenician trireme back in I think it was the 3rd century BC, and then copied it. And the funny story is they didn't realize that they had to let the wood season before you put it in the water, and the wood was too green and the thing sank. So they eventually figured out you got to let the wood season for a few years before you put the thing in the water. But eventually the Romans figured out how to make it all work, and here we are. So
okay, and the possibility of this really happening does have a precedence with Longfellow's The Wreck of the Hesperus. You mentioned that.
Yeah, so the Hesperus is a colonial ship. So I think what you're referring to is the fact that all along the north shore of Massachusetts, especially in colonial times, there were all these shipwrecks. So the Hesperus actually is a little further south than Plum Island and Newburyport. It's along Gloucester, and the final stanza reads, I always love this, "Such was the wreck of the Hesperus in the midnight and the snow. Christ save us all from a death like this on the reef of Norman's Woe." Norman's Woe was the name of the reef, underwater reef that ships coming around the point on Cape Ann would always run aground against. And there's a similar, and you actually asked this at the beginning of the interview, I never really got to answer it. There's a similar reef off of Plum Island called Emerson Rocks. And again, during storms, ships would come around around to the end of the island and sort of cut into the mouth, what they thought was the mouth of the Ipswich River. What they didn't realize was at the tip of the island underwater was this Emerson Rocks, and many ships were scuttled on those rocks. And I started the interview by talking about how 20-odd coins were found 4 years ago on the northern part of Plum Island after a big storm. But on the southern side of Plum Island, near these Emerson Rocks, periodically Roman coins have been found, and also what looks like the remains of ancient ships. I can't say they're Roman. I don't know that for a fact. Ancient shipwrecks that could be pre-colonial have washed ashore as well. But that area, both the wreck of the Hesperus at Norman's Woe, but also along Plum Island at Emerson Rocks, those are two areas on the North Shore of Massachusetts that are famous for their shipwrecks.
Well, I enjoyed your dramatic poetry reading.
I could have given you like 12 stanzas. I have them in front of me here, but I figured one was probably enough for the listeners for tonight.
But so, and we do have some very real possibilities of situation like this happening along the rocky New England shores, but you are also including the amphorae found in South America as well. I've seen some other reports on that. So there we are back to this pattern again of these artifacts, were they kind of dated to about the same time period? But it's all Roman artifacts found in South America as well.
Right. So what you're talking about is something called the Bay of Jars in Rio de Janeiro, and what that is hundreds of these amphorae, the plural, shipping containers. They're called shipping. They're basically ceramic jugs. They were called the shipping containers of the ancient world, and there's so many of them in this bay in Rio de Janeiro that the locals call it the Bay of Jars. And so eventually, a group of scientists went down there. Actually, a guy from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had developed a sort of a sonar, a way to look at the ocean bottom, sonar system, which is still used by underwater archaeologists today. Anyway, bottom line is that they did thermoluminescence testing on these amphorae, and it came out again 2nd century, Roman style 2nd century, and then similar amphorae were found off the coast of Maine in Sistine Bay, and they matched the ones in Brazil, and again the style and the dating of those, it's Iberian Peninsula dating, but again 2nd or 3rd century. So. And then you talk to the traditional historians, and they say, well, maybe a colonial ship had a bunch of ancient Phoenician amphorae and dumped them overboard. Like, well, why would a colonial ship have, at that time, 1,500-year-old clay amphorae? Why? How did they get them, and why would they have them? And it just makes no sense, And then if they had them, Why would they dump them overboard? It makes just no sense. And so, and there's also the other thing that's in South America, is actually in Mexico, Central America, is a terracotta head, and
right.
that also dates back again 2nd century. It's a terracotta head that was found beneath the floor of a Mexican pyramid, and we know the pyramid was built, I think, in the 12th century, so the head has to be older than that, pre-contact, pre-Columbus, and the head has a beard, and the Native Americans didn't have beards, and the fashion of the hairstyle and the hat that's on it is according to the experts, 2nd century, and then again, optically stimulated luminescence was done on the artifact, 2nd century. So we have a 2nd century Roman head, terracotta head, found underneath the stone floor of a pyramid that predates Columbus. So again, somehow that made its way over here. So that in and of itself is fascinating. But once again, and I keep repeating myself, we have the same 2nd century date. It's not just Roman era. It always seems to be 2nd century Roman era, which tells me that was sort of the prime time period of these excursions, or this one excursion with a few on either side of it, the main excursion. That's the cluster we're finding.
Okay, and I've been hearing this thermoluminescent testing. It seems like it's pretty accurate.
It can be. If you have an artifact like this, it's very accurate. We're using it more and more now out in the field. I know that you've had Dennis Stone on your show many times, and America's Stonehenge Mystery Hill up in New Hampshire. I've just been part of a group that we did testing up there, and it can be accurate or sometimes not so much. It really depends on the sample, and you don't know that till you get the sample back to the laboratory and analyze it. There has to be a certain amount of quartz or a certain amount of other material, but yes, if it's a good sample, it can be very accurate. If it's not a good sample, then you almost have to punt and start over again. But in these particular cases that I'm talking about, these samples were very very datable, and so essentially what it measures, optically stimulated luminescence, it measures when the last time was that either the stone or the dirt was exposed to sunlight. So you have to get into, if you're talking about a stone chamber, for example, you pull the stone away and you get dirt from behind the stone that presumably has been blocked from sunlight since the construction of the chamber, and you then determine how long it's been since that dirt saw sunlight, and that gives you the date of the chamber. So similar technology is used for these stone artifacts.
Okay. So a lot of Romerica centers on Cam and Astarte's take her to college, and that's where they encounter all these artifacts. But you have photos of them in your book. Rick has them in his book. Some of the editions of Ancient American Magazine with that Lee wrote his articles. But let's look at a couple of the places that you mentioned. There's the Falls of Ohio. Rick's talked about that location when he was on with us, and
that's a fascinating location.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's especially so. And I didn't realize this. It's Louisville, Kentucky, and across the Ohio River on the other side of the river is Clarksville, Indiana, and so that's basically where the falls of the Ohio are. Essentially, what it is, it's waterfall, and like it says, it's essentially an area of waterfalls where the topography drops off. And in colonial times, because it was hard to get through there, a lot of pioneers had to stop and sort of wait for the local guides to come and bring them across or bring them down. And because of that, a village grew up around there. It was a natural stopping point. Okay, we got to the falls, let's stop and wait, and we'll camp out here or whatever. But it goes back thousands of years, this old Native American gathering spot, because there was a good area to fish and whatnot. But what I found fascinating is it's called Clarksville because the founder of it was George Rogers Clark, who's the brother of William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. And this family, in addition to being explorers, were also avid amateur historians, and they did a lot of digging and researching, excavating, and it was George Rogers Clark who wrote a lot about this stuff in the early 1800s and wrote about Roman armor, Roman fortresses near this area. It was he that was documenting a lot of this, the things that you talked about in the early 1800s. The antiquarians were documenting. It was him. A lot of it was he. Sorry, a lot of it was he. And again, even back then, talking about how this all dated back to the Roman era. A lot of it was Welsh in addition, and that sort of makes sense if we think about the 9th Legion being stationed in England. They would have had a Welsh contingency with them, and so the language they might have used when they got here was Welsh. There's something called the Brandenburg Stone, which is written in Welsh, which basically is the translation has to do with dividing land up amongst the heirs, which again is a English/Welsh custom. But it really is this area around Louisville, Kentucky, and Clarksville, Indiana, where we find a cluster of these coins and armor and fortresses, all relating back. That's sort of the mother lode of everything. And I just found it was very interesting that it relates to the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Clark family. That all seems to, it's always round up the usual suspects, as they say, almost as if when Lewis and Clark were going on their expedition further, up the Missouri River, that they were looking for other evidence that Brother George Rogers Clark had discovered earlier in Clarksville, and that the younger brother was going up looking for more evidence of these European explorers who might have come across earlier.
Okay, and I have some harrowing scenes at the controversial Burroughs Cave, kind of working the King Juba legend. What did you find interesting about that
Burroughs
aspect?
Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, finish.
I was just like, how does this King Juba legend fit in with Romerica?
So I don't. Well, it does indirectly. So I assume that you've talked about Burroughs Cave on your show before, and for those listeners who may not be familiar with it, it's this cave in southern Illinois that was discovered in the 1970s by a guy named Russell Burroughs, and he proceeded to pull out of the cave, I don't know, in the neighborhood of 5,000 artifacts. And the artifacts are all over the place as far as style and as far as origins, in the sense that some are Egyptian, some are Greek, some are Hebrew, some are Phoenician. I mean, some are northern African. It's a crazy mismatch of artifacts, and it's sort of hard to figure out, what the story behind them is. And a lot of historians think that they were fakes, that Russell Burroughs basically produced these in his basement. I happen to think that's not the case. I think there's too many of them, and they're too elaborate, and they're too historically accurate for one person to have done these all in his basement. He wasn't all that educated, Russell, and this is the days before the internet. It would have been hard to get some of the historical details correct that he did. But anyway, one of the theories is that King Juba, who was the the grandson of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, and he ruled in the African nation of Mauritania in the 1st century. One of the theories is that it was before the Roman Emperor Caligula could come down and basically take all the money from Juba and his people, that they got out of Dodge. They fled and they took a ship and they took all the Mauritanian wealth and they went across with their sort of rainbow coalition of merchants and residents who lived on this trading area, and they went across and worked their way up the Mississippi River from the Gulf of Mexico and into southern Illinois and created this settlement, and that's what these artifacts are from. But I thought maybe it's a little bit later. Maybe instead of being 1st century King Juba, it's 2nd century 9th Legion, that maybe these artifacts, and again, if you're part of the 9th Legion, it was the 9th Legion, even though it was Roman, it was based in Hispaniola, the Iberian Peninsula, and so you would have had members of the Legion who represented all the countries of origin I just mentioned: Phoenician, Mediterranean, Greek, Hebrew, African. They all would have been part of this legion, and they all perhaps could have contributed to these artifacts. And so start looking at these artifacts that were found in Burroughs Cave, and I tied them all into the story. Some of them are Roman, some of them are African heads and Egyptian carvings and whatnot. But they, in the story, the characters theorize that perhaps this is more evidence. Again, there's more 2nd century. These artifacts are 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. No one's quite sure exactly, but definitely within the margin of error of being 2nd century artifacts. And so instead of being King Juba, it could just as easily be 9th Legion coming across and leaving evidence of their culture, of these artifacts as evidence of their culture, their history, some kind of repository of their belief systems, whatever they would have done, almost an ancient museum. But this area in southern Illinois is not too far off from where all the other artifacts were found, a little further east of that.
Oh, and you have some an interesting scene. A couple interesting scenes there. We don't have to go into detail to.
Yeah, but the bat scene was fun. Huh? There's a really cool bat scene. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was very well done.
Thank you.
I liked it.
For the listeners who haven't read my books, again, there's a lot of history here. There's no doubt about it. But hopefully it's a roller coaster ride also. I mean, the idea behind these books is buckle up, because we're going on an adventure. And by the way, we're going to learn a lot of history along the way, but there's going to be some white knuckle ride, hopefully, if I did my job. There's going to be some scenes that have you on the edge of your seat along the way, and hopefully you're going to be entertained and educated at the end of the day, because that's the kind of books I like to read, so that's the kind of books I try to write.
Okay, so the bat scene was fictitious. Okay, the Roman coins aren't, but you also go into other aspects of history that are well documented, such as the golden menorah, and that's actually in. You do let us clearly know that it's described in the book of Exodus in chapter 25.
Yeah, so
the lampstand.
So there's we know for a fact, like you just said, it's described in the book of Exodus, and it also we see it carved on something called the Arch of Titus in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
The golden menorah. One of the when we talk about the Mount Rushmore of ancient artifacts that are lost to history that we want to find, you got the Ark of the Covenant, you got the Holy Grail, you got the golden menorah. I don't know, what would be the fourth one? What if you had a fourth one? The cross, the cross that Jesus was crucified on. I don't know what the fourth one would be, but clearly the golden menorah, along with the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail, will be right up there. So what happened was,
mm-hmm.
the golden menorah was taken during the first destruction of the temple in around 70 A.D., and it, along with other temple treasures, were marched through the streets of Rome. And again, there's a great carving showing the menorah being carried by the Roman soldiers through the town on something called the Arch of Titus in Rome. But what happened to the menorah after that, no one's really sure. It sort of disappeared from history. And, some people think it was taken subsequently by other invaders in Rome. Some people think it may have been recovered and was hidden during the Bar Kokhba uprising. Okay, and I talk about that. It might have been sort of recaptured
mm-hmm.
and then hidden. And was that one of the things that was talked about in the Copper Scroll of Qumran as one of the temple treasures? Perhaps it stayed in Rome, and the Vatican got its hand on it, and it might still be in the Vatican archives to this day. Or perhaps when the Roman Empire fell in 456, I'm gonna have that date wrong. Who invaded Rome? Was it the Vandals finally who came into Rome in the 5th century? I forget who it was, but maybe they took it. Maybe they found it.
Yeah, it's St. Augustine documents it as the Vandals or Goths.
Yeah. So I use this. I use the mystery of the golden menorah as one of the sort of triggers for the plot. Like that sort of becomes in play. Are we going to find the golden menorah? And I'm not going to give it away, obviously, as to whether we do or not in the book, but that becomes one of the things that triggers the plot, that moves the plot along, the looking for this priceless artifact that, of course, is not only important for monetary reasons, but also would be really important for symbolic reasons for Israel and religious reasons for any of the Abrahamic faiths, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam. And so, that sort of adds the international intrigue side to the story.
Well, you make the point that the golden menorah tells you how to make, how it's to be made in the book of Exodus. But that artifact is, helps to make Judaism just a unique religion. It's just that concept really isn't found in to say Buddhism. This is an artifact that makes it's just unique to the Hebrew people.
Right, and it ties in. We talked earlier about the Hanukkah fort, and so
right.
The menorah is in many ways a symbol of Judaism. Judaism is the only religion that celebrates Hanukkah, and therefore has the symbol of the menorah. It's on the coat of arms of Israel, and so when we see this drawing of a fort shaped like a Hanukkah menorah in Ohio, drawn by the Armored Corps of Engineers in 1823, showing an ancient fort, it has to make people wonder, was there some kind of ancient Jewish presence in that area? Because there's no way a Christian, for example, although Christianity does share certain symbology with Judaism, obviously the Ten Commandments is a good example of that, they don't share the menorah. That's not part of Christianity. And so when you see a menorah, you know it's Jewish. It's not just maybe
right.
Jewish, maybe Christian, maybe Islamic. It's only Jewish. And we talked about Burroughs Cave, and I mentioned how I didn't think that those artifacts were fake because some of them reflect a sophistication of knowledge of history, sophisticated knowledge of history that would be really hard to know about in the 1970s. And in particular, there's a carving of a menorah that has a particular kind of base, a triangular base, that is unique to first and second century menorahs in Israel at that time, that they didn't have triangular bases except for during that time period. So there's a Burroughs Cave carving of menorah with a triangular base, and also a wall carving on a tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Michigan, which also shows a triangular base menorah. And again, we don't see that. Those are both really, it's a very narrow window of time during which the menorah had a triangular base. I just don't think Russell Burroughs, as a high school educated, he was a prison guard, a truck driver, would have known that in Israel during the first and second century, a menorah had a triangular base and not a flat base. I just don't think he would have known that, but we see that. So, but again, the big picture here is that this menorah is unique to Jewish symbology, and when we see it, we sort of need to pay attention that something might be going on there.
No, I thought you made some great points, and in your book also covers the prophecies of the building of the third temple. And I thought that was interesting. And there's where it kind of draws the reader into the international intrigue that you usually include in your books with this distinctly unique like the golden menorah, and you have the building of the third temple prophecy, and you get the Vatican in there also saying that they have a claim on the menorah. So, but how does the building of the third temple and the associated prophecies fit into Romerica?
Right. So the history of the temple. So the first temple, the original Temple of Solomon, was constructed. Don't quote me. Right, 8th century BC, I believe, and it was destroyed by the. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. I think you said that was in your books. It was really long ago. Okay.
Yeah, it might have been 900 BC, 800, 900 BC, in that range. The Temple of Solomon, famous that God wouldn't let King David build it because David had blood on his hands, and eventually Solomon built it. And if any of the listeners happen to be Freemasons, obviously that's a big part of Masonic ritual and whatnot. It was built by King Hiram Abiff, the Phoenician king. King Hiram, I'm sorry, and Hiram Abiff was the builder. But anyway, so it was built by the Phoenicians. But and then it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 500 BC, in that range. And then it was rebuilt by King Herod, who ruled during the first century. And it was that temple that was eventually sacked the second time during the uprising, and the Romans destroyed it. That's when the golden menorah was carried out, again, around 70 A.D. And it has never been rebuilt since. And part of the reason is that, basically geopolitical realities. The Muslims in the interim had built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. And so there's really no practical way to build, to knock those down or build over them or around them or anything. But that didn't stop some religious Jewish groups from dreaming of building that third temple back on top of the Temple Mount. And one of the reasons why some Jewish religious scholars think it should not happen or cannot happen is they don't believe you can have the third temple without the temple treasures. Well, if that golden menorah and other temple treasures were to be found, now it would open the door to building the temple. And you can imagine the conflagration that might create in the Middle East if a group of, say, religious Orthodox Jews decided now was the time to rebuild the third temple, and of course the Arabs living in the Arab quarter in Jerusalem and worshiping at the Dome of the Rock would say, "You're not building anything, guys." And of course, you end up with a war again. So, as if the Middle East needs any more reason to be at each other's throats. So that I sort of get into that in the book again as another piece of, as you called it, international intrigue that sort of raises the stakes, raises the temperature, and gives motivation to the characters. I think that it's important if you're writing, a thriller or an action-adventure story and you want murder and mayhem, that can only really happen if the stakes are high. People tend not to do, really violent things or really risky things over a couple bucks or over silly things. I mean, it happens occasionally, but generally speaking, if you're going to have that kind of murder and mayhem, you need to have high stakes. And so I always try to come up with some kind of geopolitical intrigue where the stakes are high, where groups like the Mossad care about what's going to happen, and where the characters are really motivated because the stakes are so high.
As we talk about history tonight, we're getting a wide sample of your interests, but it's all very exciting the way you present it.
I have a lot of fun. This is a bit of a sidetrack, I know, but I really have a lot of fun researching these stories and then writing them. People ask which I prefer more, the research or the writing, and the truth is I find them both fascinating. The stumbling upon some of these ancient artifacts, and they're almost like an ancient jigsaw puzzle, finding enough pieces so that we can put them together and create a picture where none existed before. I just think that's so cool to be able to look back in history and then to be able to write a story where this is sort of my style of writing. It's not the same as every author. Some authors like to really outline everything and script everything out, and then they write it. To me, I don't do it that way. I just sort of start writing, and I let the characters eventually carry the story wherever it's going to go. It's almost like having teenagers when you're a parent. You did create them, but you really don't know what they're going to do, right? And so that's what it's like. If the story comes alive, the characters come alive, they carry the story. And as a writer, that's a really fun ride to be on. You almost switch over from being the creator to being the reporter. You're almost in a position of reporting on what your characters do. And they do some really surprising things, like teenagers, and sometimes they do infuriating things, like teenagers. But it's always interesting. And so that part of the process, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you sort of bog down and the story doesn't really flow well, and you got to really, like pulling teeth. But sometimes it really does happen. In this particular book, it did happen, and it was a really fun ride for me to go along with the characters on their adventure. So the research was fun, and the writing was fun, and boy, it just I feel so fortunate that I stumbled upon these ancient artifacts, and I'm able to write about them, and enough people like to read the stories that I can make a living doing it. But it's a really fun way to get out of bed every day. Somebody said to me once, if you love your work, you'll never work a day in your life, and I think that's so true. If you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life.
Cool. That's a great attitude to have.
I know you love what you do too. I mean, I know this is your passion. You enjoy this stuff. You enjoy, talking about it and being part of it. So yeah, so it's We we'd probably both like an extra zero at the end of our paycheck every week, but it's as long as we're doing okay, we have fun with it. So
yeah, no, you're it is fun. Dotting the I's, like you said, it's making all the connections. But so we've covered a lot of the Holy Land, Roman information, but Astarte brings a Native American to already captivating story, and she has an international heritage as well that would appeal to readers on wide variety of readers.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I had forgotten to tie that in, but that's an important part of the story. So the characters are Cameron Thorne, he's 45, 46 years old in this story, and in previous books, he and his wife Amanda had adopted a young Native American girl at the time from the Mandan tribe. I won't get into how that all happened and why it happened, but she's now a freshman in college, and part of a big chunk of the book is Cam and Amanda driving across the Ohio River Valley on their way to Montana State University in Bozeman, and Cameron and Astarte in Bozeman. And the reason Astarte wanted to do this drive is she wants to learn about her Mandan heritage. And we know the Mandan tribe, when Lewis and Clark, there they are again, when they first met the Mandan, would have been up in the Dakotas. This would have been the early 1800s. But Mandan history tells us that prior to being on the upper Missouri River, they were living originally centuries earlier in the Ohio River Valley. And so Astarte wonders all along during the story, and the Mandan, by the way, were known to have European features, European features and appearance, but European like religious practices, other attributes that early observers thought were not Native American, that they were some kind of European origin. And so the Mandan were called the White Indians, as a matter of fact. And so Astarte all along is wondering, are these Roman explorers, are they my ancestors? Are they the original genesis of the Mandan tribe? Did they come over here and either mix in with the Native Americans and produce the Mandan tribe, or perhaps the Mandan tribe is really just the residue of these Roman explorers, probably the first more than the second. I mean, at some point it's going to be intermarriage. But she's basically on a journey of discovery as they're looking at these artifacts, trying to figure out if these people are her ancestors. And so that's an important part of the story. And that's a theme that's been carried through from the second book in the series, Thief on the Cross, when we first meet Astarte as a little 5-year-old girl, 6-year-old girl, I forget what, 5 or 6-year-old girl, and she has a prophecy that she was born with, that she's supposed to be the sort of the spiritual leader of the Native American tribes in America, and I get into that in and out of different books, but the prophecy is not so important in this book as much as her trying to figure out her heritage. That becomes an important motivating factor for her as we go through the story.
Yeah, and like you said, Thomas Jefferson was very interested in the Mandan tribe, but there that element of oral history, folklore, whatever term you want to use, but there really does seem to be some type of truth or real event once you peel away all the layers of embellishment over time. From the folklore story, there seems to be something there, and maybe with these Mandan legends, we do find evidence that Welsh, Europeans, were here, long enough to marry into some of the native tribes.
Right. So you mentioned a couple of things. So you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He himself was of Welsh heritage, and so he believed the whole legend, or he was curious about the Mandan legend, the White Indians, the Welsh Indians, and so he sent Lewis and Clark up to find them and investigate. But again, when we talk about Welsh, remember this 9th Legion would have been partly Welsh. It would have been comprised of many Welsh soldiers, so that fits in together. Soon after Lewis and Clark went up looking for the meeting, encountering the Mandan and reporting back to Jefferson, a guy named George, I think his first name was George Catlin, who was a chronicler of Native American life. He went and lived with them for a while. And let me, if I could read what he wrote, it's fascinating because he noticed how that they were the only tribe that used stretched animal skins to build their canoes, which that mirrors the style used in the British Isles. In fact, Tim Severin sailed one of those boats across from Ireland to Newfoundland to prove the Brendan the Navigator legend, from the 5th century, 6th century. But anyway, so Catlin wrote, quote, "I am fully convinced that they, the Mandan, have sprung from some other origin other than the other Native American tribes. A stranger in the Mandan village is first struck with the different shades of complexion and various colors of hair which he sees in a crowd about him, and is at once almost disposed to exclaim, 'These are not Indians.' There are a great many of these people whose complexion appear as light as half-breeds. Among the women particularly, there are many whose skins are almost white, with hazel, with gray, and with blue eyes." So again, he goes in, he talks about not just their appearance, but their lifestyle, some of their religious practices, their culture. And it's fascinating. And again, so Jefferson was interested in this. It ties back again to Lewis and Clark, and so you can see why Astarte, who is of Mandan heritage, by the way, most of the Mandan were wiped out by a smallpox outbreak in the early to mid 1800s, but there's a few survivors. But you can see why she, being a college freshman at that age, trying to figure out her own heritage, is intensely curious about these artifacts and the history that they find along the way on their journey across the Ohio River Valley and then eventually up the Missouri to Montana.
And go into the use of language much in Romerica. You did with Echoes of Atlantis, but you're one of the few authors that actually goes into using language to prove a point that there was another culture, that came later and they all mixed together, so something like that. And you in Echoes of Atlantis, you went into the Basque language, but there is that element of research that you do present in your books that be ignored.
Well, so I didn't do as much of it on this one because have you ever tried to read Welsh? Oh my gosh! But it's hard to But you're right. There was there's a little bit of there's an ancient Welsh script on the something called the Brandenburg Stone, which I talked about a little bit before, and one of the translations of that stone is it's basically a sort of a division of land or a boundary marker, and so that's consistent with Welsh and British Isle practices. But you're right, as far as actually using linguistics, which I have done in other books. My daughter happens to be really interested in linguistics, so she helps me with that sometimes. But yeah, I didn't do as much of that with this one. Again, mostly because the Welsh language is just so hard to decipher. Oh my gosh! But I am fascinated. So I think it was Echoes of Atlantis, which you mentioned. But some of the language that the medieval Catholic Church sort of used to promote their agenda. So, for example, the word lunar, as most people know, is associated with the female because the menstrual cycle matches the lunar cycle. And so from there we jump off into the medieval church thought, women were a little bit unstable, a little bit crazy, and from that we end up with the word lunacy being associated not just with women particularly, but with the lunar cycle, because it's a female thing, lunacy, just like the moon is a female thing, lunar. And so you see a lot of evidence of as the language evolved during medieval times, a lot of that sort of stuff. I think that's what you're talking about, and I am interested in exploring those things, and I do find that stuff fascinating.
One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence was, I think he was born in Wales, and I don't think his family emigrated here. I don't know when it was, 1740s or so. I don't know. But he was held captive for a little while by one of the Pennsylvania native tribes, and he said that he could understand what they were saying.
Right. So there's that.
Yeah, I forget which. I have the. Someone goes on a rant. I could get the book, and it's just right behind me. It was. But
the guy's name George Sevier, Sevier. I might have that wrong actually, but
I don't know.
Anyway,
if you want to,
the big point is it.
If you want to read more, go ahead and read more poetry or something. I'll get the book. I'll be right back. I'll try to find his name.
Yeah, actually, I'll just to continue.
David?
Yes, hi, Barbara. Hi, yes.
David, hi.
Yes, I do.
Are you aware of the real reason that Jefferson sent the guys out looking for Welsh-speaking Indians?
Well, he himself was Welsh, so that had something to do with it. But you have something else to do?
I do.
Go ahead.
Before Spain and France and England started on their explorations to claim new lands, there was a papal bull that was issued, and they were told explicitly that they could claim any land they found.
You're getting back to the John D stuff, right?
No, only if there were no Christians living in that area.
Right.
So Jefferson had heard about possibly Welsh Indians, because if the Welsh were here before, then the English didn't have claim to the country. Therefore, they couldn't sell the country or free it.
Right. This goes back to John Dee and Elizabethan. He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth in the 1580s. He came up with this whole idea that the Welsh, this goes back to Prince Madoc, that the Welsh had settled in the New World, and that therefore England had a right to, this was again before the Pilgrims came over, but England had a right to North America because the Welsh had been here. This is the Prince Madoc legends. And so, yes, you're right. Jefferson was trying to, A, I think he had a personal interest in it, but you're right. B, it would have been a lot easier to take that land as opposed to have to buy it from France in the Louisiana Purchase if he could show that there were, some kind of English or Welsh settlers in that area, and it would have been what we call today the Dakotas or Montana, up the upper Missouri River. That's a very good point.
I
do have one more thing on the language. I don't know if Mark is back, but on the
I'm here.
All right, the whole lunacy thing. The other part about that is the word sin, sin, is the Babylonian word for moon, and so therefore a sinner is also a moon worshiper or goddess worship. So again, that same use of language to demonize behavior we don't like, to demonize the female. I just wanted to finish that thought. We talked about it, and I wanted to circle back to it. So, but Barbara, you're I never put those two. I never put two and two together. I knew about the John D. Welsh thing, and of course I knew about Jefferson's interest, but I never put two and two together. And that's an obvious thing I should have seen. Thank you for pointing that out. That's a good point.
You're welcome.
You always have. I don't know if the listeners care. The listeners have no idea how often Barbara helps you with plot ideas. I mean, she's like the most valuable player in some of my books. So if the books are good, you can thank Barbara. If the books are bad, you could say that was one that Barbara didn't help on. That's what we'll do, huh?
Oh yeah, I'm all for it.
There you go. Okay, Mark, did you find your find what you're looking for?
Yes, it was. The signer was Francis Lewis of New York.
Okay.
And it says during the French and Indian War, he was a agent to supply the British troops with clothing while on some mission. In 1756, he was captured by the French. Legend has it that he saved his scalp from the Indian allies of the French because the Indians believed he was speaking their tongue when he talked to them in his native Welsh. So, if we're going back to 1756, and it seems like there is the natives understand the Welsh language. At some point, the Welsh, the Gaelic language had to have come to America's shores. It's such a unique sounding language that you just don't make up those sounds. Yeah,
it's a tough language. So if they understood it, they're better men than I, because I don't understand it. But the point, and again, it's I go back to my legal training on this, that it's really hard to win a case with just one or two pieces of evidence, unless they're really compelling. And so that in and of itself is probably not enough to convince people that the ancient Welsh were here. But when you start having 8 or 10 artifacts and a bunch of coins and stories like that, and the appearance of the Mandan tribe, and the fact that they make their boats the same way that they do in the British Isles, and just this accumulation of evidence, at some point you just start saying to yourself, look, this is not the way the world works. This all doesn't just happen by coincidence, that much similarity. It just can't all be coincidence. Common sense just takes over. I had a law professor who used to say, the most important tool that you bring into the courtroom is your common sense. And so I think readers understand that they understand the way the world works. And I think what we find here in what I hope I showed in this book is that there are so many pieces of evidence. So we haven't really even talked about all the different coins that were found. We didn't talk about For example, the Roman anchor that was found. Let's talk about that for a sec. So we talked about Lee Pennington. One of the things that he found, along with a guy named Bruce Grimes, they're active in, I think it's Kentucky, researching all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There's a giant stone anchor with a hole in it. It's triangular shaped. It's almost the size of a trash can. You find in a park, and it was found. This is the interesting thing. It matches in style other Mediterranean anchors from the Roman era. Okay, but what's interesting about this one is it was found about a quarter mile away from the river, and so people are like, well, how could that be? Why would you have an anchor a quarter of a mile away from the river? Well, it turns out that one of the things that they did, the colonists did when they first started settling along the Ohio River, is they redirected the flow of this particular river near the anchor and moved it about a quarter mile into a different path. And so this anchor lies in the historic bed of the river, not the colonial era bed of the river. So the anchor obviously was left there in pre-colonial times. It just fit together really nicely once you realize the original flow, the original path of the river. So again, Roman era anchor in the ancient path of the river. It just, you have to have an explanation for it. What else could it be? So it's just stuff like that. And I didn't find any of the stuff. It's people like Lee Pennington and Bruce Grimes who are doing the research. I'm just piggybacking off of their research and trying to put the pieces together. But there sure is a lot of it.
Yeah, you have a photo of it on page 57. There's a hole drilled through the top of it, obviously for the rope to be tied to it.
It's huge. I mean, the thing is massive. This is not the type of thing people do just for fun. It would have taken 4 or 5 guys to carry the damn thing. I don't know how much it would have weighed. I forget if I put in there the estimated weight or something like that. But did I, Mark? I forget. You're on the page right now, aren't you? Did I put the weight on there? Probably not.
I don't think the weight's on 56 or 57.
Yeah, no. There's a formula. It's like per cubic foot how much a stone weighs, and I knew it at one point, but it doesn't matter. It's big. It's heavy.
We don't do math on Night Light. So.
Look, you almost made me do Gaelic, buddy. If you're gonna make me do Gaelic, I'm gonna make you do math. Jeez.
Now you do have the size of the. It's nearly the size of a trash can.
Right.
About where it's located. I'm not. I can keep looking for the.
No, it's okay. It's
weight,
fine.
but
doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's heavy. We'll just say heavy, big and heavy. So that's all we need to know. It doesn't matter if it's the point. The point being is these things don't just. They're not casually created or casually moved or casually left. That there's usually some kind of significance behind them. People don't do that just for fun. Life back then was too hard to be dragging around, 1,000-pound stone anchors for no reason.
It is on page 58 that you note that it weighs 400 pounds.
Oh, there we go. I got it. Okay. I did have it. Only 400. I would have thought it would be even heavier, but okay, whatever. So good, 400 pounds. So it'd probably take at least 3 guys to move around. Anyway, what else you got, buddy? What else you want to talk about? You must have. You always have a lot of questions. So
let's see what. I thought Romerica was really a very enjoyable novel. Great, fits in perfectly with your series, and you leave it open for a part 2. And I think you should do a part 2, called like Claudio America. Matthias gets caught up in some kind of laptop scandal, and Astarte needs to decompress or something. So she goes.
So I did start. So my tradition is every year on January 1st I start a new novel, and the goal is to write one a year. I was actually able to write two last year because of the pandemic and being cooped up as much as I was. I was able to finish 2 entire books, which was great. But I started again on January 1st. As a matter of fact, Barbara had a really good suggestion for one of the sort of the plot lines, I've got Astarte with some of her Native American prophecy stuff going again, and of course Cam's on the run, and he's actually down in North Carolina now on a road trip. The fictional Cam, a fictional character, and I've found some good stuff there. But so I'm not gonna do a sequel of Romerica yet, but the characters circle back in and out. You'll see there's a character in Romerica, a Mossad agent named Rivka. She'll circle back in and out. She'll be back in a little bit for this book, and we'll see how that goes. But it's fun to have these characters that are recurring once in a while. And then the other thing we haven't really talked about much, but one of the things I was really pleased with, and I don't want to give it away to the listeners, but there was a fun little twist. There was a legal hearing in front of the Underwater Archaeology Board. Do you remember that scene, Mark?
Yeah, at the is that the one at the Falls of Ohio?
No, there was a hearing in Boston in front of the Underwater Archaeology Board, jurisdiction over the shipwreck, and I had a really fun little legal twist in there, and I don't want to give it away, but because I'm a lawyer by training, I like to do some legal things, some legal angles, and oftentimes my plots turn on real estate scams or this was a really fun little legal trick. Do you know what I'm talking about, Mark, with the jurisdiction over the shipwreck?
Yeah, and
I don't want to give it away, but I wanted to hear if you thought it was fun. I wanted to hear if you liked it or not. Basically, I was fishing for a compliment there, buddy.
I liked it, and
when I amuse myself, that's usually a good thing. When I especially with the little sneaky lawyer tricks, I always think those are fun. So.
No, you do have those little. You work in those legal twist things. It makes for the surprise endings. But you have all these things, subplots and characters that come in and out of the story. Do you find it a challenge when you do the denouement where you have to make sure that all the strands of the story are unraveled and the book comes to some kind of logical end?
The second part, that's not hard. The logical end. I mean, obviously, I'm writing towards an end. The sort of the loose ends, making sure that everything's tied up, making sure that everything's consistent at the end. That can be a little bit, that's why you have something called beta readers. So the process I use to write the story is I write about, say, 75 to 100 pages, which is about a book's about 300 pages. So I write about 75 to 100 pages and give it to my wife, who's a really good editor and a really good eye for this stuff. And thankfully our marriage relationship is strong enough so that I can take her criticism and not take it personally. But I give it to her, and she basically goes through and gives me very candid feedback as to what works and what doesn't work. And so then I'll write another 50 or 75 pages, and she and I go back and forth on this 5 or 6 times. So she's got the worst part of this job. She's got to read sometimes the same pages 6 times. But by the end of the story, she's read it through, the ending only once or twice, but the beginning many times. By the time she's done, I've got a pretty good idea what works and what doesn't work. The problem is she's read it so many times that she might have lost track, just like I've lost track of things that I thought I dealt with or things that I changed and need to deal with. And so the next step after that is to give it out to somewhere between 10 and 20, I call them beta readers. Everyone calls them beta readers. And those are basically people whose opinions I respect, who are interested in reading, who are very careful readers and candid readers, and I give it to them and ask for feedback. And, once I gave it to my mother, and, of course, mothers don't like to criticize their kids, and she had nothing negative to say. And I said, thanks a lot, Mom, but that really doesn't help me very much. This is a time when I need you to be critical and tell me, that doesn't work, or you left a loose end, or you need to fix this. So I found a good group of people who are candid and careful and critical and whose opinions I respect. And they tell me things like, you got a loose end here, or you really didn't provide enough character motivation for that, or I saw that coming a mile away, you need to hide it better, or you know what, that scene on page 220 that went on for 3 or 4 pages, it really dragged, you got to cut that back, or that kind of stuff really can help, because the story not only has to work as a story hold together, but pacing's important. There's almost always a mystery in these stories, and ideally you want your reader to say, "Oh, I should have seen that coming. Well done, author." You don't want the reader to say, "What? That came out of the blue. That wasn't fair," or "Oh, that was obvious. I saw that coming a mile away." What you really want to do is have the reader say, "Oh, yeah, well done. I should have seen that coming. I see." You want to have enough foreshadowing and enough evidence sort of scattered through the story that the reader doesn't feel cheated. But again, you don't want it to be so obvious. And that's where these beta readers come in really handy is I say to them periodically on the way, so, what do you think is going to happen? Or did you see it coming? Or, did it work for you? And then after that feedback comes, then I make whatever tweaks are needed, and now we're finally in final version and we can go to print. So that denouement question about having everything wrapped up at the end, usually if I've messed that up, one of the beta readers will have caught that, and so hopefully there's no loose ends, hopefully there's no inconsistencies in the plot. If there are, bad on me, but that's how that usually gets caught.
What have any of the beta readers recommended that Astarte fall in love with a podcaster who's really handsome and dashing and all that?
But we can't seem to find a good role model for that. We can't seem to find a handsome, dashing podcaster. It's just those. It's almost like they don't exist. I can't imagine why that would be, Mark. I don't know. Well, also, Mark, she's a little young for you, buddy, I got to say.
Oh, well, she's in college. But, it's like, it would be a good scene with, like, Cam hates him because it's like, when he gets his $600 Rona check, that's 600 times more than he's going to make, being a podcaster. How's he going to support your royal heritage? It'd be you might want to run that by the beta readers.
Beta readers, okay. Hey, I did want to mention one more thing because at the very beginning of the interview we talked about Rick Osmond, and I happened to just pull his book down. So he wrote this book. What the heck year did he write this? At least 10 years ago.
It was 2011.
Okay, tell us about. So in the acknowledgments at the end, he wrote, David Brody, there is still potential for some great thriller fiction in here. And thanks for helping out. So basically, even back then, so 10 years ago, or when he first wrote this 9-10 years ago, he was already telling me, hey, there's a good historical fiction story in this, and it took me that long to come around to actually focus on it and dive deep enough into to take him up on it. But I do want to thank Rick because again, this story piggybacks off really his research and his Ninth Legion research that he did way back then. So again, I don't know if I have the story exactly right. I did that little detour over to Israel with the Ninth Legion, but I think that sort of makes in my mind, that holds everything together. That's a key piece of this. That explains, not only were the Romans here, but there's so many artifacts that it had to be a fairly large contingency of them to justify all the artifacts, not just because they're scattered. I mean, there's some in New England, there's some in the Ohio River Valley, there's some we talked about down in Brazil, there's some in Mexico. If in order to account for all of the artifacts, there had to be a decent number of trips back and forth, which makes sense. And I think once people stumble their way across, or if they happen to, have a Phoenician sea captain who was captured, maybe the Phoenician sea captain had been across and would tell them how to get there. But the point being, people who did come across would have kept it secret. I get the question all the time, well, how come nobody knows about these journeys, these ancient journeys? And again, the answer is secrecy. If you were take the Phoenicians, for example, it was not uncommon for a Phoenician sea captain who was being pursued by the enemy to run his ship ashore on the rocks and drown the crew rather than give away the Phoenician trade secrets, the trade routes, the trading partners, because there was such an economic advantage that they had. They didn't want their enemies to be able to compete with them. And so if ancient Romans did find their way across and they were trading with the natives, they were mining copper or other minerals, they perhaps were finding gold, they were fishing, they were beaver hides, whatever it was, there was economic advantage associated with that. Or perhaps they were hiding from their enemies in Europe, as the Templars were in later years. There were economic advantages to that, and so those secrets were kept and maintained, and they were not written about, and that's why we don't have recorded history of these trips back and forth. Again, you don't tell people where your favorite fishing hole is. It's your favorite hole for a reason. You want to keep it secret, and so that in my mind that fits together. That sort of makes sense. But it only makes sense in the Roman artifact side of things if we had more than just one or two trips back and forth. There had to be sort of regular trips. But again, I think it's clustered in the 2nd century because that's where the artifacts generally are clustered.
Okay, and with the copper scroll of Qumran.
Yeah.
You mentioned that's where we know all the artifacts that were stored in the temple, and the Ark of the Covenant's mentioned in the Old Testament.
So what happened? Let's explain that before we gloss over that, and then I'll let you ask your question.
Okay.
But the copper scroll of Qumran, basically, so the Israelites, the Jews, they're revolting, and they know that at some point the Romans are going to come and try to put down the revolt. So they take all the treasures out of the Temple of Solomon, the temple in Jerusalem. Again, it's been about 60 years since they rebuilt. So they've been able to rebuild and gather their treasures again. And they say, well, we're not going to leave them in the temple for the Romans to get when they come and squash us. And so they hide them, according to this copper scroll, in 64 different locations. And they're basically common locations in the laundry bin and underneath the stairs here. It's all very colloquial. It's almost like saying, down by the gas station next to the tree below the stone wall. Okay, it's stuff like that, which wouldn't mean anything today, but back then, of course, it did. And there were 2 copies of the scroll. One of them was found, in the mid 20th century, out in the desert. This copper scroll. The other one we think was probably kept, and that's how, when the Israelites escaped under my theory, with the treasure, it would have been that list that they used to find the treasure in the laundry room and beneath the stone wall, whatever, and took across. But according to the author who wrote this Copper Scroll of Qumran book, whose name I forget, which I can get for you, is Feather, a guy named Feather. There's about $1.5 billion worth of treasure in that, described in that scroll. So no one's ever found that. Again, some point, they've got the 64 locations, some of which obviously are obscure, but some of which are identifiable even today. It's all gone. So something happened to that treasure. So that's sort of the background of the Copper Skull of Qumran, and there's a cool picture of it in my book. And by the way, just for the readers who haven't read my stuff before, even though it's fiction, I do include images of the artifacts and the sites, just because I think that it's important that readers understand when I'm talking about these artifacts and these sites and the artwork, that it's real stuff. I'm not making that up. The book is fiction, but the history behind it is not. So you don't have to go to the internet looking for the stuff. You can it's right there on the page, which I think is helpful. But anyway, so I interrupted you. You had a question about the Qumran scroll. So.
Yeah, okay, so we have an inventory of the temple, and in your Treasure Templari book that came out last year, there's another list of more artifacts from the Holy Land and Spear of Destiny. What I found interesting about those two books is that the treasures that came out of Jerusalem have really been marvels of the world. It just really they really capture the viewers' imaginations from the first Indiana Jones movie or your books, or it's really something about magical.
The whole the Mount Rushmore of lost treasures, and they all tend to be biblical, or most of them tend to be biblical, because there's something magical, like you said. So in Treasure Templari, for example, Hitler was obsessed with finding the Templar treasure because he believed that it was that some of these treasures, like the Spear of Destiny, could be, and the Holy Grail, could be used, could be weaponized. He actually believed that they had magical powers and could be weaponized. So the Treasure Templari novel talks about how there was a painting in Ghent, in Belgium, called the Ghent altarpiece, and it has a number of different paintings comprised in one giant. It's called a triptych, an altarpiece. But one of the paintings Hitler believed was a secret map leading to the Templar treasure, the Holy Grail, the lost Templar treasure. And like you said, Mark, these treasures, in addition to having monetary value and historic value, they have religious value, and perhaps, according to Hitler and others, they have supernatural powers. The Fountain of Youth, Hitler believed that potentially he could live forever if he found the Holy Grail. It was the Fountain of Youth. And this kind of stuff has, incredible allure. And this goes back, and you mentioned that my series of books is called the Templars in America series. And in Romerica, I don't go too far into the Templars. I touch on them a little bit, but most of my books focus largely on the Knights Templar. And one of the key questions that continually we ask about the Templars is, what was it that they found in Jerusalem when they were excavating beneath the Temple Mount in the early days of their existence, in the early parts of the 12th century, somewhere in the early 1100s? What did they find? They found something that they were able to parlay and leverage into incredible wealth and incredible power. And the leading candidate for what they found was the treasures that were hidden from the Romans during either the original uprising in 70 A.D. or the Bar Kokhba uprising in 132 A.D., that the temple treasures, including potentially the Ark of the Covenant, whatever else you think might have been under there, that they hid them, and that the Templars excavated down beneath and found them. And maybe they were not those things I mentioned. Maybe instead they were ancient writings of Christianity. Maybe there was a marriage contract between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Maybe there was ancient secrets of the ancient world, navigational secrets or technological secrets of Atlantis. I mean, who knows what it might have been under there. Whatever it was, they were able to take it back to Europe and leverage it into great power, so that within 10 or 20 years of the order being founded, they had become one of the most important and powerful entities in all of Europe, in all of Christendom. And so something they found made them really powerful. And then within about 200 years after they were founded, that same something, whatever it was, caused the church to turn on them and outlaw them and crush them and basically end their reign. But whatever those two things were, I think they were probably the same thing. We don't really know what it was. And that just captures people's imagination. It was a treasure.
Yeah.
What kind of treasure? Where is it now? Did the Templars bring that treasure even after they were crushed? Did they bring it to America? Did they hide it here? Yeah, maybe. Hitler thought maybe. So who knows?
Okay. Dave, we're down about 2 minutes left.
Wow, already? Okay. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, that really seems like we've only been doing this for about 30 minutes, but it's been a lot of fun. I still think you need a character named Marcus Edwards as the podcaster, but we'll keep working on that. But do you have anything else coming up? TV shows, anything you can promote? I know that book signings are kind of out.
Book signings are definitely out, I'll tell you that. But no, I'm doing a lot of these radio talks. I think I've been really happy with the response to Romerica so far. So if listeners,
it's a good one.
Yeah, I really thank you. I appreciate it. If listeners want to jump in on the series, I would suggest either jumping in at the beginning, which is Cabal, the Western Knight, or jumping in at the end, right at Romerica. All these books are standalone, but you can jump in any place you want, of course. But I would say readers would enjoy, if they enjoyed tonight's conversation, would enjoy Romerica. I try to keep these books really affordable. So if you want to buy the paperback version, it's $15. If you want to buy it on Kindle, it's less than $5. The goal for me in writing these is to get them out there, is to get people talking about them, to sort of move the needle on this ancient history and try to get people thinking, open their minds to the possibility of exploration prior to Columbus. So I want these to be accessible. I don't want it to be really expensive, but and obviously, hopefully if you like one or two of them, you'll read more in the series. But I try to make them fun. You can tell by the passion in my voice. Boy, do I love this stuff. So I hope readers will share in that passion and go on the journey with me. And thank you for having me tonight. It's always great to be on your show.
Yeah, and they can find out more about you at davidbrodybooks.com.
Yep, and you can get the books on Amazon and Kindle. That's probably the easiest way to get them. But yeah, davidbrodybooks.com, Brody. You'll see all the books there, and click through, lead you to Amazon and Kindle. And my email address is on there too. Feel free to reach out. I love to hear from readers what they think, what they like, what they didn't like. It's always good to get feedback.
Okay. I think that's about a wrap. And thank you so much. And Barbara, you can close up the show. Thank you, and good night, everyone. We'll see you next week.